Please turn in your hymn book to number 575, which will be our closing song and our song of invitation. Good morning, folks.
Good morning.
I want to begin our lesson this morning, which is entitled Looking for the Unseen, which seems rather incorrect, but that's the topic. And that's what we want to talk about. But let's begin this morning in the book of Acts. If you'd like to turn to it, to chapter 19. Chapter 19 tells us about an ancient city in modern-day Turkey called Ephesus. Ephesus was one of those cities that was a tourist attraction in the ancient world. The city is no longer there. The ruins are there, but that's all that remains. And every year there are a horde of archaeologists who go to that place to try to undig the ruins of Ephesus. The reason it was a tourist attraction was because there was a temple there, a very large, ornate temple dedicated to the goddess Diana. The goddess Diana, of course, represented a lot of things to the people of the ancient world, but to us it's almost meaningless. But the Apostle Paul went to Ephesus to preach. There was no Church of Christ in Ephesus. Christianity was unknown in Ephesus, and for all practical purposes, Ephesus was a city that worshipped idols, chiefly the goddess of Diana. But the Apostle Paul went there and he preached for several years in Ephesus. And we know from other statements made in the New Testament that not only was there a church established in Ephesus, there were other churches that were established outside of Ephesus. And Ephesus became a city where hundreds and yes, even thousands of people were converted to Jesus Christ. Now, if you read in the 19th chapter, you will find that many of the practices in Ephesus were what we would today be calling magic practices. And there were books that related to the people about how to perform these so-called magic acts. But on one occasion, these new converts to Christianity were so intense, so subject to do the will of Christ, they wanted to be Christians. They wanted to act like a Christian. And they learned to hate idolatry. And they brought their magic books to the town square and they set them on fire. No Ephesian Christian wanted to have that relationship with idolatry and false magic in their homes. We'll bring these books and we'll burn them. Someone, and I don't know who, but the scripture says that there was someone that counted the value of the books that were burned, worth what we would today call $50,000 in silver. Their measurement, of course, wasn't in dollars. But it was valuable. But they burned them as a sign and as a significant action on their part that they're no longer engaged in these magic and practices of idolatry. We also know, and we're going to look at this here in a moment, that in the city of Ephesus, there were thousands upon thousands of people there that came as tourists to visit the temple. And outside the temple, probably within the shadow of the temple, were a number of men that were engaged in making idols of the goddess of Diana. They were small idols, probably somewhere in the range of 4 inches. They were made out of silver. And the men that made them were silversmiths. And when the tourists came to town to see the temple, they had them for sale. And they made their living selling these idols. One of them, who seems to be a ringleader of this guild, a ringleader of what is today a modern labor union, was so angry at the preaching of Christianity, so angry that so many people were turning to Christianity. He thought within himself that it was something I need to do about this. And I want to do some reading for you in the 24th verse of that 19th chapter. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines or idols for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, now I want you to listen carefully this morning to what Demetrius said to his fellow silversmiths. Sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth. That's where our money comes from. Moreover, you see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that there be no gods which are made with hands. That's an interesting comment by this silversmith. He says this Christianity has taken over our city. And not just our city, but throughout all Asia. Now, what he meant by Asia in those days was basically what today we call Turkey. So Paul's preaching had made a major impact because people were turning away from idols. And notice what this silversmith says about Paul. He says this Paul is going around and say there is no God or gods except the God of heaven. And there is certainly no God made out of silver. But listen to what else he says. So that not only is our craft in danger to be set at naught. Let me change that wording a little bit. He's saying what's going to happen is we're going to lose our jobs. Nobody's going to want silver idols of Diana. We're going to lose our job. But go on. But also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worships. There were two things that disturbed this man. One, he's going to lose his job. Number two, people are going to despise and reject this magnificent temple. Now, I don't know what the temple looked like, but I have seen archaeology and their drawings of what they think it looked like. Magnificent building. And inside this magnificent building, in what we would call today the atrium, was this magnificent idol of Diana. It's beautiful to see. And now this Christianity is coming along and saying there is no God. And this magnificent structure will be despised, and someone might even tear it down. Besides that, all Asia worships this goddess. I want you to see something this morning. What was this man worried about? Notice the very first statement. He says to his fellow silversmith, this is where our wealth comes from. Number one thing he's worried about is his money. Okay? It's his money. And the second thing that he's concerned about is a magnificent structure. Wonderful. I like to see it. Undoubtedly, when he got up every morning and went to work, he passed the temple of Diana. Maybe he even went into it and offered a sacrifice to this idol. Those were the things that he was concerned about. But there was something else going on in his world that was more important than his money, more important than the temple. The thing that was most important, he wasn't concerned about. The temple of Diana is gone. It's not there. The city's gone. It's not there. And archaeologists would be delighted beyond measure today if they could find one of Demetrius's silver idols. They're looking for them, but they can't find them. Most likely the silver idols were melted down. Everything that he was concerned about is gone. What he'd missed was what Paul was teaching. Demetrius knew Paul. If he didn't know him in person, he knew about him. By the way, there was a school of preaching in Ephesus. Paul taught there for 2 years, called the School of Tyrannus. But folks, Paul was preaching a message. It was the message of Christianity. Now, we want to turn our attention to our text. I hope everybody in this room takes some time to read the text today. Take your proclaimer home so you don't forget where the text is. And read those verses for a few moments. It says 2 very important things. Number 1, Paul says, and I'm going to paraphrase all of this. He says, first of all, we're getting old. Can anybody relate to that? We're getting old. And he says, as we get old, we have problems. Can you relate? You know, our hearing goes, our feet hurt, our back aches, and then all the other problems. Paul says we're getting old. But he says there's something good. We may be even experiencing persecution. But we're getting old and we've got problems. But he says there's something getting better in us. You know, you think about it for a moment. What's getting better in your life? Your hearing getting better? What should be getting better in our lives is our faith and our respect for God, for His Word. Paul says even though we're falling apart, inwardly our spirit is getting better. Have you ever noticed in our world that some of the men and women that have the greatest faith, the greatest love for the Son of God, are older people? They've been through it all. They've seen everything. And their faith is stronger now than it's ever been. That's the first thing Paul says. The second thing that he says is that we need to look for things that are permanent. And he distinguishes between two things. He says the things that are seen are temporary. The things that are unseen are permanent. Modern day America that you and I live in is exactly 100% like Demetrius in Ephesus. What does our country think are important? What are those things? I guarantee you, if you listen to the politicians, and by the way, you've been listening to them, hopefully Wednesday it'll be better. But you listen to the politicians and everything is about things, right? The economy. Who was it? A politician said several years ago, the important thing in America is the economy. That's what Demetrius said. America is interested in money and material things. But all those things that Ephesus was worried about is gone. All those physical things, they are gone. Paul says, let's not be concerned with the things that are seen. What are they? Well, obviously it's money, material things. You know, folks, stop and think about it for a few moments. Demetrius is still alive. You realize it? The scripture says, and Jesus even approved the statement, that God is not the God of the dead, He's the God of the living. When we die, what dies? Our bodies, not our spirit. Where did David say it went when it left this world? Went back to him that gave it. Demetrius is alive, folks. But what about all of those things that he was worried about? They're gone. The things that are seen in this world, you know, there's a lovely maple tree out there. It was probably planted when they built this building back in the 1860s. But there were 4 of them out there, and 2 were gone, and one's looking in that direction. They're not permanent. Our world isn't permanent, folks, because the Lord said through the Apostle Peter that God's going to destroy this world someday. Hadn't done it yet, obviously, but He's going to. This world's not permanent. And you know, it's a dreadful thought for some people, but we look at our own physical bodies and it's not permanent either. And one day, it will be placed into the earth, and in a very short time, it will go back to the dust from whence it came. It's not permanent. The things that are seen in this world are not going to last. Heard someone say, I think last week to me, we just bought a new car. It's the last one we're going to buy. And I know that family. And I know when it gets 30,000 miles, they say it's wore out, so they get a new one. But that new car is not going to last, is it? And by the way, how long is the smell going to last? Probably won't last 2 months, if that long. Everything you see is temporary. I had a mother tell me one time, she said, the best time in my life was when my children were young. And I wished, and I thought at the time, that was always going to be the way it was. You know what those nasty kids did? They grew up. All her wishing didn't keep it the way she wanted it, because it's temporary. We're here temporarily. Well, what are the unseen things? Well, there are a lot of things. I remember being in this building one time as a child, and the preacher standing up and saying, we often say, look out the window and see the wind. But we don't see the wind, do we? All we see is what the wind does. But the scripture speaks of one thing over and over again that we've not seen. That's God. We've not seen God. The scripture, matter of fact, says, no man hath seen God. God is unseen. He's a spirit. The scripture often describes God in human terms in the sense that we might understand him, like the hand of God or the mind of God. But God doesn't have physical hands. He doesn't have a physical brain like ours. He's a spirit. He has no beginning. He has no ending. And I know you and I can't comprehend that. But he's unseen. But the important thing to remember is he's permanent. He doesn't change like we do. God's permanent. Therefore, we must remember that God made us. There's no life without God. He breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living soul. In other words, God gave him life and gave him a soul. But that physical life is going to end. Oh, how many times I've heard people say in and out of the church, I wish I had known George Washington, or I wish I had known my great-great-grandparents, or I wish I had... Why don't you know them? Because they're not here. They're gone. Folks, God gave us life, and he set the bounds of our habitation. 17th chapter of the book of Acts. God has set our years, the limits of our years. We may live to be 100, but we're not going to make a 200-year mark. And the average age of the funerals that I've conducted, I don't know what, 600-700 of them, was about 36. I've only conducted 2 funerals of individuals that were 100 or more. One was 101, the other was 104. But I've had a lot of children's funerals where our time here is limited. And if we live a full life, we get old. And what should we be doing? We should be concerned about our Creator, what He wants us to do. There's something else that's unseen. That's our eternity. If our spirit is going to live on forever, and it is, Jesus said there are two places where we can dwell for eternity. One of them is a place of punishment. The word commonly used to describe it in our time and age is hell. And men really have tried, and they failed, to describe this place that we can't see of hell. The Scripture describes it as a place of torment. It's often called the place of death. Not death in the sense that it starts and ends, but that death continues over and over again. As one man put it to me, hell is where you die every day, forever and ever. Jesus said there's another place, which He did not speak of as much as He did the place of punishment. It's the place of reward, but more importantly, it's the place where God is. It's the place where Christ is. It's described as a place of light, as opposed to a place of darkness. It's unseen now. Those are the things that are unseen that are permanent. And that's what we should be setting our sights on. Not the things that are seen. You know, I can see the beautiful leaves floating by outside, out there in the cemetery on the road. That's really pretty. Just kind of like to sit down and watch it for a while. But I know in a few weeks that scene will be white. It's temporary. And now I want to make a very important point. Even though this life is temporary, even though the things we see and we work for are temporary, we need to use what the God of heaven has given us to help us prepare for the things that are not seen, that are permanent. The Lord wants us to work with our hands. He says so. And what do we work for with our hands? Money. To be used for His purposes. You know, the Apostle Paul worked with his hand and he made tents. I thought about that every once in a while. He didn't have a Singer sewing machine in his tent, making more tents. That needle and thread stuff. Can you imagine? But what did he do that for? So he'd have some money where he could go preach the gospel. I love Joe Warndale, and Brother Leroy read that letter to you from him. I knew him 30 years ago. And he and I designed the Timothy teams that he put into action that he describes. Joe's paid a salary by the church that sponsors him in Haiti. Joe uses all of his salary on mission work. He's been beaten. He's been kidnapped twice. He's been held for ransom once. You know, Joe's body's wearing out. He and I are about the same age. And I keep thinking, Joe, when are you going to retire? But he won't do it. You know, folks, what we got is temporary. So let's be using it for the purpose of helping us to prepare for the time when we're going into the next world, to see the things that are permanent, a permanent heaven, and avoid that permanent hell. Every time I read that passage over in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I think how important it is that we look for the unseen. I want to encourage you to read that passage. Now, I debated whether or not to talk about that first part about getting old, but I figured some of us knew all about that part. But the important point Paul's making is, if you're working for the things you see, you're on the wrong track. You better be working for the things that are unseen. We offer the invitation of Christ to become a Christian. We do that every time. That's tradition on our part. Scripture doesn't say that. Because the reason it doesn't say it is the invitation of Christ is open all the time, 7 days a week, night and day, for those individuals that want to become a Christian, like they did in Ephesus. They confessed the name of Christ as the Son of God. They were baptized for the forgiveness of their sins, and they were urged to walk in the light, in the faith, until this life was over. The invitation of Christ is extended again while we stand and sing, please.